Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. We are in season 6 on growth, but we're going to do a little side tangent episode here, and I'm really excited for this. We have with us today a pretty amazing guest. This is Colin Carr from Carr Realty, aka the massive realty company that helps thousands of professionals, specifically in healthcare, every single year find their office, renegotiate all of that. Colin, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so ironically, I know Bobby Lind. He's with Carr Realty here in Indianapolis. Pretty amazing guy. And I didn't realize Carr Realty is a big deal. And I was like, okay, let's talk with Colin Carr. How did you start this commercial real estate company?
So that's a long story. I'll try to give you the quickest version possible. My background, I started managing apartment complexes when I was 19.
Okay.
I got into brokerage when I was 23. And I did everything. I chased any deal that would move. I did retail stuff like Walmart's, Wendy's, Blockbuster. I did a lot of industrial. I did a lot of office. And long story short was after a number of years of doing a lot of different types of transactions, I had a chance to start working in the healthcare field. And I started listing medical office buildings, working with a lot of large national landlords. And I saw firsthand that when healthcare providers would try to negotiate on their own in these transactions, that they were getting just crushed. And I had a couple deals specifically where I was on the landlord side, and really great doctors, great people were coming to the table trying to either lease a brand new space or renew their lease. And I remember just watching them get literally manhandled by these landlords that owned hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. They negotiated professionally for a living, and the doctors were just getting crushed. And so
and unrepresented usually, right? So it's just them. They're like, hey, I saw a sign. I'm going to call. I want this space. Let's do it. I'm going to open an office.
Yeah, I had several where they were unrepresented, and then I had one where they hired a friend of theirs that was a residential real estate agent. And although well-meaning, she might as well not have been there because she had no idea what she was doing. And so I just had a couple of transactions where I watched the doctors lose arguably a couple $100,000 compared to what they should have got if they were properly represented, if they had a strategy, if they had a posture, and if it was a level playing field. And I made a decision in 2009 that I was going to start a company that did exclusively healthcare representation and only worked on the tenant and buyer side. So only working for the doctors. And I launched that in February of 2009. And it was received with immense success. And we grew Colorado for a couple of years, got up to where we did hundreds and hundreds of transactions in Colorado. And then in 2015, we started going into other markets. And today we are in over 40 states. And as you mentioned earlier, we have the privilege of representing thousands of healthcare providers every year with their commercial real estate.
That's amazing. So how many people do you have out there working for Carr Realty? Like, what's the size of your company now?
We've got about 130 people that are out and about in different places throughout the country. Some markets are more established than others. We're opening a pretty high number of markets moving forward. We spent years and years building our system and our processes and all the different relationships which allow us to grow faster. And so we're in a place now where we're probably going to add right around 40 to 50 new markets per year moving forward. And
wow.
Just opened Sacramento, just opened Boise, just opened Charleston. So there's so many markets where we're able to help more people now, and that's really what we're all about.
That's awesome. Well, and it seems like what you just described, I love that story of you just saw these providers like trying to do it on their own, trying to, work with the local realtor. I think we don't realize how much leverage and how great of tenants that physicians and dentists are. So talk to us about that. Why would an average landlord of a commercial space be inclined to maybe not give dentists the deals that they're due, and why do we have any advantages walking into these situations?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you have two types of landlords out there. You have the landlord that maybe hasn't done a healthcare transaction for a dentist or for a veterinarian, and they don't know anything about it. They're just thinking themselves, Maybe it's loud, maybe it smells, maybe some type of tenant they want, and they're more prone to a traditional office user or a retailer. They're just ignorant. They haven't experienced it yet. They don't know the truth about the strength of healthcare providers, how low the default rates are, why they're so desirable. That's one side. And then the other side is you have the landlords that are 100% aware that healthcare providers have the lowest default rate of almost any industry. They do long-term leases. They pay rent faithfully. They pump a significant amount of money into the spaces. And those landlords want healthcare deals. Then they will push hard to get a healthcare deal, because when the market corrects, like we've seen recently with COVID, and people start shutting down locations or downsizing or not paying their bills, healthcare providers find a way. Like if it's a bad year, a dentist is not going to decide to, call it a day and then start a landscaping company. I mean, they're going to find a way to get through whatever they need to get through. And so those landlords understand it. The goal for a healthcare provider when they're going into a negotiation is to make sure that that landlord understands how strong of a prospect they are. The fact that they do long-term leases, that they have such a significantly low default rate, that they're going to find a way to succeed in an up market and in a down market. The fact that they pump a significant amount of money into their space. Those are all things that you can use to leverage to get a landlord to push further to make the deal. Because the landlord is looking at it saying, all right, do I want to lease this space once over the next 10, 15 years, or do I want to lease it 3 or 4 times? Do I want to put my money on the tenant that has less than a 1% default rate? Or do I want to put it on an industry like a restaurant, which has an 80% default rate in the first 5 years alone? And so educating landlords, that's a big part of getting to a level playing field so that you can achieve more favorable terms.
And looking at some of this and talking with some people and having been through some transactions, it seems like there's 3 ways that a dentist can, or anyone can negotiate for commercial realty. One is, or I guess, or 3 ways that you can benefit. So there's the lease rate, there's TI improvements, and then free rent if someone's doing a startup. Those are like the 3 main things, and then you can play with term. Talk to us about like how that all plays in, and where people miss out on free money there.
Yeah, absolutely. Most landlords, and this is what's different between commercial and residential, most landlords are willing to contribute towards getting a new tenant. If they're going to sign up a tenant for, let's say, a 5, 7, or 10-year lease, they're going to give them concessions, which come in the form of a tenant improvement allowance, as you mentioned, or TI allowance. They're going to give them the ability to negotiate for free rent during the build out, but they also will give free rent upon opening as well, if it's represented properly, if it's negotiated properly. And then you have lease rates, you have annual increases, you have options to purchase, you have renewal terms, you have exclusivity. If you're in a specialty and you don't want someone else doing the same thing, dropping into the same building or center, that's there. You have assignability clauses, which is, what if you want to sell your practice? Can you not only sell the practice, but can you also get out of the lease? That's a big one as well. But when it comes to the economics, you've got lease rate, TI allowance, and free rent. Those 3 alone can affect the deal by tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars over a 10-year period. And they're all negotiable. And really, if you go into a deal just asking for one term or trying to get something, or whatever the landlord offers you, you ask for lower on the lease rate or higher on the TI allowance. If you don't have other viable options that you're negotiating against, that you can actually reference or say, hey, this landlord's offering me this, you're offering me this landlord's offering me this, I can get this down the street, here's what it looks like if I purchase. If you don't have those other options teed up, ready to go, you don't have a basis for measuring one deal against another. And that's a huge mistake people make, is they just get an offer and they think, all right, well, negotiating is just whatever lease rate they give me, I'm going to ask for lower. And whatever TI allowance they give me, I'm going to ask for more. And they just take this idea, well, I'll just pick numbers. Landlords don't respect that. They know when you're bluffing. They know when you have no idea what's going on. And they'll tell you, they'll say, hey, send me the offer on the other property that's offering you that. And then if you're sitting there like, well, I can't, if you can't substantiate it, and I'm not saying that you should send another landlord's offer because that might have a confidentiality clause there, but the fact that you can't even talk intelligently about it or you can't reference it, you're telling the landlord right away you have no idea what you're doing. Right. That's a big mistake people make.
I am in the process of doing a denture and implant startup with some cosmetic and general dentistry on the back end of it. kind of a specialty type practice. And one of the things that at shared practices we see as a common mistake for dentists is that they don't go big enough in their initial real estate. Is that a common thing that you see people do, that like everyone wants to go as small as possible and find the smallest possible space and cram as many operatories into that? And then you lock in this lease and then you outgrow that space and you have nowhere to go. What options do people have, or how do you address that when someone's kind of just saying, oh, I just want to get the smallest possible place?
Yeah, that's definitely a common mistake that healthcare providers make. And it's understandable. You don't want to overextend yourself. You want to do the best you can with what you have. You want to be as efficient as possible. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if you get into a situation where you outgrow your space and you could have easily used another chair or two or three or another bay or another exam room, depending on your specialty, that's a significant amount of money that you just lost. And so you've got to try to find the size space that's going to fit your needs long term. And there's a ditch on both sides of the road, because you can also go way too big and you can end up paying on a lot of space that you're not going to use for 8 or 10 years. We try to tell any client, let's figure out the optimal size space that's going to allow you to grow. So you're not going to fill it up the first 3-4 years, but you've got to be able to fill into it or grow into it, before you get 3/4 the way or halfway through your lease. So we got to try to find that range that gives you room to grow, that allows you to expand, but doesn't put it to the place where you're never going to get there and you're going to waste a significant amount of money having built out a space that you can't use a portion, or paying rent on a space that you only use a portion as well. So ditch on both sides of the road. It's different for every provider, but yeah, you got to find something that's going to work for you long term and short term.
Yeah, and looking at a 10-year lease, that's the hard part, is that it's like, to do a build out, you're going to get a loan to do that. Usually that's a 10-year loan, so you're looking at a 10-year lease, and finding that sweet spot of what can I grow into in the first half but not be hating it in the second half.
Yep.
Um,
And
which
we see people make mistakes on both sides. They'll lease a space, and 7-8 years they're nowhere close to where they can fill that whole space. And then the flip side is we see people lease a space, and then 2-3 years in they're busting at the seams, and they're starting to look at how much lost revenue they're having because they can't see as many patients as they want to, or they have to go to longer hours, more days, things they may not want to do. And so yeah, it's a balancing act. If you have the ability to get an option, a first right of refusal on an adjacent space, that's a great way to protect yourself. Some landlords will give that to you. Again, it's called an option on the space next door, or a right of first refusal on the space next door, that before the landlord will lease it, if it's vacant, they'll give you the first shot at it. That's great. But sometimes you can't control that. If the spaces adjacent to you are already leased, there's only so much you can do.
Right. So if you get lucky and you've got a vacant space on the other side, you can expand into that. Um, what happens if you get to the point where you're like, I have to move, and the lost revenue is worth the lost the rent, or the differential. If you move out and you still owe rent to this old place, what can be done in that situation?
So if you have a lease and you sign a personal guarantee, which the vast majority of leases require you to do that, and that's fair because again, the landlord's giving you a commitment on their part where they're going to give you the space exclusively, and in exchange you agree to pay them rent. Well, if it's a $500,000 lease or $1 million lease or $1.5 million, I mean that's a obligation of that amount of money. So they're going to require a personal guarantee in the vast majority of transactions, especially in light of them giving you that tenant improvement allowance, that free rent, and other concessions. So if you sign a personal guarantee, you're on the hook personally, no different than you are with a student loan, a credit card, an auto, a home. I mean, if you look at it in life, almost any area in life that extends credit to you or gives you something of monetary value, you have to guarantee. Eventually, if you get large enough, you can try to limit those guarantees. You can try to get those to go away. Sometimes on lease renewals, you can get a guarantee to go away. But if you're personally guaranteed, you're obligated to pay that rent. Landlord is obligated to mitigate their losses. There's common law that talks about that in most states. But yeah, if you decide to move out, you're still on the hook. In an ideal scenario, we start asking questions of, is there a space adjacent we can expand into? Yes, that's great. If no, next thing. Would it make sense to do a second location? Would it make sense to try to get either a satellite office or a true second location to where you can reach another segment of the market, another aspect of the population, and you could grow your practice and your brand by doing another location, that's there. And if not, then you're trying to figure out, all right, do you know someone, or how easily could you release your space?
Hmm.
And then are you comfortable with somebody who might have the same use as you coming behind you? Sometimes yeah, sometimes no. I mean, if you were an orthodontist and your space was built out exactly the way you wanted it and you wanted to stay in the immediate area, you're probably not that excited about another orthodontist backfilling your space, because all your patients already know that's an orthodontist space. You don't want to lose people to that. You don't want to change that brand and that image. So um, yeah, I mean, there's only so much you can do. You're typically locked into that lease though, and the landlord would have to get another tenant in that space to let you off.
Right. Well, and that's where I was saying, if you're growing to the point where you're like, hey, my current lease is 4,000 a month. My lost revenue from not having a bigger space, we're busting at the seams. We could have a whole nother provider. We could have another hygienist, or two more hygienists. And you make that call of like, it's worth it to me to, you know, find a bigger space somewhere else. Um, it sounds like you could continue to pay that. You're going to continue to pay that until, is that a sublease or is that someone taking over your lease, or can both happen?
Both can happen. It's the most optimal for the doctor to get the landlord to write a brand new lease so that you're fully removed from it. If you do a sublease, you're still ultimately responsible. If that tenant were to stop paying rent, it would roll up to you. And so in an ideal scenario, you get a new tenant, either you'd have someone or the landlord would start marketing it, and they would release your space, and then they would terminate or cancel your lease, write a brand new lease with a new tenant, and then you'd be off the hook and ready to go away.
Okay.
Your point, though, as well, there are a lot of times where if you look at the lost revenue, it's worth eating the second lease payment. And it's really just a comparison. And if you're looking at a space, maybe you said it's $4,000 per month, that is a business expense, that is tax deductible. And so if you factor that through your tax bracket, maybe the effective cost of that $4,000 per month is only $2,500 per month to you, because it means you're going to pay less in taxes now because you have more tax deduction. So you might say, hey, listen, I'm going to pay either an extra $1,500 per month to the government, or I could receive a $1,500 break, and my net effective on this is $2,500 because I'm paying more in rent. That's a viable option as well. And if you could pick up an extra 15, 20,000 per month in revenue, that's just a business decision at that point.
Well, and the reason I'm talking around this issue a lot is because this season is on growth, and we have helped people, and we one of my partners, Dr. George Hariri, um, he has grown his practice. He's moving into a second space. He's got a lease on the previous space he's moving out of. And we're big fans of a large multi-doc location. So, a practice with two or three doctors has a lot of efficiencies, has the ability to kind of lead and grow, and is a lot easier to scale than maybe three different separate offices. So that's something we kind of coach towards, and we've had a lot of clients as well that have hired us to coach their practice. We help grow their practice, and all of a sudden, the real estate is the rate limiting factor for them. So with my startup that I'm looking at here, I'm trying to ride the other edge of that, without hitting the ditch. I'm looking at a 4,700 square foot space, possibly. I want to do 12 operatories, and I'm going from zero to this. Have you ever seen anyone do anything crazy like wall off a section of their real estate and just like don't even build it out until they're ready for that portion?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there's two ways you can do it. You can do exactly that. You can wall it off and leave the other area as just open storage or just a shell space. And then that way you're not putting any of your resources into that. Other people, it depends. If they were going to build out, let's say, a 7 operatory practice, in that situation, you're probably better off to plumb the entire thing, get the whole thing ready to go. You're not going to order the cabinetry and obviously the chairs and some of that for the ops that you're not ready to occupy yet. But it makes sense to run all the compressor lines, the water lines, the drains ahead of time. If it's a practice the size of what you're talking, though, it could definitely make sense to only build out as much as you think you're going to need for the first few years. And then by the time that you are ready to move into it, then you open that up and then you go from there. You design the space from the very beginning based upon the entire footprint, but they can easily do it in phases. And that's very common. You'll see that happen all the time with with schools, with municipalities, government, universities. They do that all the time. They design a very large building or campus, and then they build it in phases, and it makes a lot of sense.
Well, and the other thing is that if you, because the alternative for me, it's like I could go out and find a practice to buy and try and expand into an adjacent space, make it a multi-doctor type practice. But then your break room, your lobby, your other common areas, all of a sudden you've doubled your team size, and people can't even sit around the table to have lunch or to have a team meeting. Like the shared facilities of the whole office start to make less sense, especially your patient, flow and your front office and administration. So kind of building it out for what you eventually want, but limiting your costs is it's my goal. We're going to see how it goes.
Yeah, no,
it, it,
there's a lot of architects that will tell you too. Again, I'm not an architect, but have worked with hundreds of them. There's a lot of times where it doesn't make as much sense to expand or to grow a location, and you're actually better off. It's more cost effective to go build a brand new space. There's times when you are trying to shoehorn this footprint of you've got to not only add the operatories and all the other areas, but the waiting room all of a sudden is not large enough now. The break room's not large enough. You don't have enough doctor's office, and all those things, they don't fit anymore. And you can get a really inefficient and a poorly laid out space. And so it's not uncommon to have an architect say, listen, we can do this, but you're better off just to start over from scratch. It'll be more seamless. It'll be less disruptive to the practice, and we can do it more effectively. And that's very common.
okay. Okay, cool. Um, let's talk about here for a minute, timeline. Um, I have already made the mistake of reaching out to Bobby. Bobby and I sat down and looked at, here's what I think I want. And then I came back to him as we were getting ready to go look at properties, which we did this last Friday. And I'm like, hey, you know what? You know how I said I wanted 3,000 square feet, like 3,000 to 3,500 and 7 operatories? I'm actually thinking closer to, 4,500 and 12 operatories. And fortunately, kind of everything in that size range in the criteria that we were looking at, he had made a list of, and the spaces that we were looking at either had that option or had you could combine 2 or 3 spaces. Um, Sometimes people jump the gun reaching out to a broker and starting to look for spaces. Is that the first step, or what should people do before they come and reach out to Carr Realty and find buyers representation on a startup?
Yeah, I mean, we love having a conversation early, whether it's you're ready to go, let's go look at properties next week, or even if you're saying, hey, I might not be ready for 6 or 12 months, that's fine. We love knowing ahead of time what you're looking for because we'll keep an eye out for it as we're doing other transactions.
Hmm.
Our typical agent is working on several dozen deals at all times, and it's usually all throughout the market. So if you say, hey, listen, I would like to be in this area. This is what I'm looking for. I'd love to own, or whatever your criteria. It's never too early to have us start paying attention to that. As far as us actually getting out there and getting into the most comprehensive due diligence and make sure that we uncover every property option and that we don't miss anything, that's whenever you're ready. For us personally, you get real estate. You also get financing. That's obviously those two go hand in hand. But a lot of time the lenders are going to say, well, what are you looking at? What does it look like? And so then they need to pull us into really commercial real estate and lending go hand in hand. And
Hmm.
commercial real estate agent needs the lender typically to make the deal happen. And the lender needs the commercial real estate agent to say, what's viable? What can we do? What are our options to lease? What are our options to purchase? And so whether it's commercial real estate, whether it's lender, those are usually the first people that are in the process.
Okay. And it helps beforehand if they have nailed down their vision of what they actually want and their sizes and the type of practice that they're going for, which was evolving for me as I was going through this process. But that's good to know that you're not annoyed to be involved early in this discussion.
No, not at all. And really, that's the whole point of it is, when you have a conversation or two, or you go out there and start looking at properties, you're going to get a picture very quickly of what you're looking for. Especially if you've never done this before, whether you bought a practice and you already had a location, you never went and really looked at real estate options, or it's
Hmm.
your first practice or your second location, or excuse me, you're expanding. If you haven't really been through the process before, that's what it's there for. Is you get out there and you start looking at properties and you start saying, you know what, I like the window line of an office building rather than the window line of a retail center, or I like the exposure and signage of being in retail, but I like the feel of a medical office building better, or you start looking at these things and you start narrowing down further of what gets you excited, where you feel it's going to have the best location for your practice. And that could be location as far as part of the market or part of town or the city. It could be the type of property. It could be whether you lease or own. You start to see things and it helps you to figure out what you're looking for. And that's what the process is there for.
Yeah, an interesting thing that I didn't realize before I went out this last Friday. It seems that medical spaces are more expensive, but they tend to have less like signage and exposure. But like you said, way more windows, kind of a more professional setting. You're not going to have like a CBD office opening right next door, or stuff that nothing against CBD oils or whatever, but you have less control over your neighbors in a real retail space. Is that pretty much true across the nation, that medical spaces are more expensive than commercial, like, or retail?
Yeah, well, it's important, first of all, to get an apples to apples comparison, because you could go look at a medical office building and they could have either a triple net lease or a full service lease, but it could include utilities and janitorial. And then you could go look at a retail center that looks like it has a lower face rate when you add up the lease rate and the operating expenses, but it might not include utilities and it doesn't include janitorial either. And so it's important to get an apples to apples comparison. Utilities can run $1.50 to $2.50 a square foot in a retail center, and janitorial can run $1 to $2.50 a square foot as well, depending on how deep the cleans are, how often, et cetera. And so it's important to make sure you have a true apples to apples comparison, because you could have one property that looks like it's $4 a square foot cheaper, but once you bring in the comparable resources, utilities, janitorial, or other aspects, it could end up being the same thing, or the medical building could be cheaper. That being the case, a lot of time medical office buildings are a little bit more expensive, and that's because they usually have a heightened level of cleaning, common areas, the actual spaces themselves. They have higher levels of utilities. They're usually run at a higher level as far as property management, and there's usually a higher touch as far as the management company that's involved, how often at the property, who takes care of what. Another thing, commercial versus an MOB or medical office building, is who's maintaining the HVAC units. Again, you get all these other things there where you're not paying attention, thinking, well, it looks like this is cheaper, but you have to then pay for utilities. You pay for janitorial. You have to then maintain the HVAC. If one of the units goes out, you have to replace it in a retail setting in a lot of scenarios. And so it's, again, the long story short here is, know your options, look at multiple scenarios, get a comparison so you can see this property versus this property versus this property. But then you've got to figure out, all right, what is the total cost of each of these spaces? And that's part of the process also.
That's interesting. Have you seen a shift of dental going more retail than medical space than it used to? It seems like that used to be the thing, was, you're always in kind of this like dental feeling office, whereas nowadays it's a lot more common to find dental in either strip mall or retail area otherwise.
Yeah, a lot of dentists love retail. They love the exposure of the signage. They love the ease of parking, just walking right in the space. There's a lot of things there that are beneficial. On the other side, a lot of doctors also like having a better window line. They like being in a more professional setting of a multi-story office building or medical office building. It's about 1/3 retail, 2/3 office or medical office is what we see across the country. But again, it really depends on markets. It depends on what's available. If you're looking in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that's very different than if you're looking downtown Los Angeles. So a lot of it depends on what market are you in. I mean, you could go downtown Los Angeles and have 2 or 3 properties that are consideration. You could be in the outskirts of Tulsa and you could have 14 properties to choose from. And so it really depends on the market that you're in. It depends if you're leasing, if you're owning. That's very different as well. But yeah, people love retail for the signage, for the ease. They love it for the fact that you get synergy with other retailers. If you're in a grocery acreage center, or if you have 40,000 cars driving by your space every day that have a chance to see your sign, that's tremendous exposure. Conversely, there's some benefits of being in office buildings or MOBs as well.
Cool. This episode is brought to you by Swell. So all of us who are already using Swell know that it crushes reputation management. It's like turning on a steady stream of reviews that requires no effort from your team and just works. It's amazing. Additionally, it makes it easy to stay in touch with all of your patients before and after their visits. And it even has a great way to set up a virtual waiting room. But there's more good news. Swell has a brand new version of their platform. And on top of being simpler than ever to use, you can now actually get patients to pay via mobile, which is incredible. The reason that Swell is so effective at getting reviews is they make it easy. They've now brought that same ease of use to paying for dental treatment even after patients have left the office. Mobile payments are a great way to text them a reminder so they can pay at their convenience right on their phone. They can pay via credit or debit card, ACH, or even Apple Pay or Google Pay with just a few taps. No more phone calls, no more chasing people down with emails and letters that always seem to get lost. And it gets better. This new release includes Swell Schedule, which is an easy way for patients to request an appointment time that works for them, so you can lock down those appointments quicker. Listen, Swell is one of those things that you just need to try it out, turn it on, see the results, and then you're converted and you're like, well, I'm never going to shut this off. Listeners of the Shared Practices podcast can try Swell for free for 30 days. No commitment. Just set it up, see the results for yourself before you pay anything. To take advantage of this offer, head to swellcx.com/shared practices. That's swellcx.com/shared practices. And this is all great because it's like everyone has their bias. And my bias is a little bit more retail because of the signage, the exposure, that setting, and it tends to be what I was looking at. It was a little bit more affordable, but maybe I need to look at all of these other little factors. But it seems like don't assume one thing one way or another. You got to look at properties, you got to look at the details, and having someone who's seen a lot of these deals and been through a lot of these at your back is key to this whole process.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, and that's really that's the game plan. You can have a preference of office versus retail, and if you feel strongly, that's great. If you want to say I have to be in office, no problem. That's what your agent will go help you find. Or I have to be in retail, I have to have a big sign, no problem. What we advise most people is let's go look at all your options. Let's look at options to be in a commercial or retail building. Let's look at a medical office building. Then let's look at maybe a traditional office building. Let's look at all the options, and then let's look at also lease versus purchase. And let's go to the market and show you your top 5 to 8 properties. Let's then negotiate on your top 3 or 4 properties simultaneously because it's done on a non-binding basis. We can trade paper and go back and forth multiple times, multiple rounds before we lock in. And that gives you, the doctor, the benefit of saying, all right, I know what office versus medical office looks like, and I think I can make an informed decision. I've seen 3 or 4 landlords as far as what they're willing to give me when it comes to tenant improvement allowance, free rent, lease rate, and I feel like I'm not leaving anything on the table. I don't feel like I missed seeing a good option. I didn't miss going back to one of them. I went back 3 or 4 times. I've seen the best and final terms. I know leasing versus purchasing, and when you get to that place, you can make an informed decision. You can say, you know what, that's the best property for me with the terms that I'm most comfortable with. Or I'm willing to pay more for this because I'm getting this benefit, and it allows you to make a decision with peace of mind. And again, that's ultimately what you're trying to accomplish when you go to the market and look at options.
Well, let's shift gears here. What about kind of the current economic COVID climate?
How do you capitalize on the current situation? And that's what you should do. I mean, landlords capitalize when the lease rates go up. They get a lot more heavy-handed. They get a lot less likely to negotiate. Landlords capitalize. Same thing when the pendulum went the way of the tenant or buyer, 2001, 2007 or 8. I mean, tenants were capitalizing like crazy and landlords were getting crushed. So yeah, you do the best you can with the market that's in front of you, and you should capitalize, and you shouldn't feel bad about it. That's the game. Well, here's what I'll tell you. You can get a better deal today than you could have prior to COVID.
Okay.
Obviously, no one's a fan of COVID. We wish COVID wasn't here. We wish COVID would go away. No question. But the reality is landlords are more motivated today than they were back in February prior to COVID hitting. All right.
Yeah.
COVID has caused a lot of landlords to realize that they had some shaky tenants, that they had tenants that were operating on a shoestring budget, and they were just basically a month or 2 away from going out of business. And a lot of landlords have lost people that they thought were going to be there for a long time. A lot of landlords are seeing tenants now saying, I don't need this location. I don't need as much space as I thought I did. So they're downsizing or shutting down locations. And so landlords right now are bracing for what they believe is going to be a tougher market than they've been in. The government did a great job with the PPP and other programs, kept a lot of people alive, but a lot of people are starting to realize they're going to lose more tenants. And so landlords right now want to make deals. If you're a new doctor looking to do a new location, or if you're a doctor looking to do a second location, a startup, whatever it is, landlords want to fill their vacant spaces, and they're willing to give you a more aggressive lease rate and higher concessions in most markets. Not all markets. There's some markets where even despite COVID, the interest didn't change and they're still doing really well. But in most markets, landlords are willing to get more aggressive to make a deal. If you're a doctor that's in a space right now looking at a lease renewal, no landlord wants a vacancy right now. And because of that, they're going to get more aggressive on your renewal with lease rate, with TI allowance, with free rent, with what have you. And so if it's positioned properly, you can get a better deal today than you could have, 7 or 8 months ago.
Okay. And I guess the how to negotiate that is what you guys do. Where do people
I start with this? As far as what do you do to capitalize right now?
Yeah.
It all comes down to you have to have multiple options. Like if you go to your landlord and say, send me an offer, what you're saying is you have no clue what you're doing. You have no clue what you're doing. When a doctor shows up and starts talking to a landlord, and that landlord negotiates professionally for a living, and they own a building that's worth millions or tens of millions of dollars, or they have a portfolio, it's like the zebra walking in front of the lion. Like just the lion knows, like, hey, I'm gonna have you for lunch. It's the same thing. I don't care how intelligent this doctor is. I don't care if they're an orthopedic surgeon and they've prepped for 15, 16 years to get to where they could even be in practice by themselves, or whether, it's another form of a doctor that went to a specialty program for 2 years. It doesn't matter. If a doctor calls a landlord, the landlord knows that doctor is not serious. All right. If Chipotle's go into the market, they have either a team of in-house professional agents or they hire brokers externally that all they do is negotiate for a living. If Starbucks is doing a deal, it's the same thing. Charles Schwab, Lockheed Martin, it doesn't matter who they are. They have professional agents that negotiate for them, and landlords are accustomed to that. They're accustomed to sophisticated agents, either internally or that are hired externally, that do their due diligence, that know the market, that know how to negotiate, that are going to get 4 or 5 landlords in the mix competing against each other. And if you don't have that, there's no way for you to convince a landlord that you're serious.
And I love what you say about having multiple deals. So we're looking at 4 spaces, and I have one that I definitely like more than the other ones in terms of proximity to where I am, ease of access from the highway, just the overall like feel of the building. Like this is the space I want. But if any of these other 3 spaces are a good enough deal, or have enough concessions in it, then I'm like, you know what, I'm willing to consider these. And that's a nice place rather than this like fear-based, like I have to have this spot at all costs.
Yeah, we tell clients, listen, you can definitely have your preferred property. In fact, you go tour and you look at 5, 6, 7, 8 properties, you're going to walk away almost every time saying that one right there is my favorite property. That's totally fine. But the beauty of having 2 or 3 or 4 other options that you're looking at is you have a basis to compare. You actually have a measuring stick of comparing the deals now. And without that, it's very tough to understand if you're getting a good, average, or bad deal. And so even you might choose that property even if it costs more, but you can measure it and say, you know what, this costs more, but it's worth an extra $2 a square foot for me to be in this property because it's a better location, it's got better co-tenants, it's got better exposure, but you have a basis to compare that to. And conversely, you might find out that your property is exactly the same price as 2 or 3 others. And in that case, like this is a no-brainer. It costs me the same or it costs me less, and I like it substantially more. It gives you, again, the peace of mind to say, I'm making the best decision for my requirement for the current market right now. And every night you put your head in your pillow for the next 10, 15 years, you don't want to second guess that decision because it's a multi-million-dollar decision. By the time you
Yeah.
pay rent for 10 years, you get a loan and you pay for build out, you get all the equipment and technology in there, you hire all the staff and all the people, and then you go through all the marketing. It's a multi-million dollar decision. And so no real estate agent should ever guarantee you I can get you this lease rate or I can get you this much TI or free rent. That's deal by deal. But what a really good agent can do is say, you've seen the market, you know all your options. We went 3 or 4 rounds of negotiations. We didn't leave any money on the table. And then when you, doctor, decide this is the property that I want, you're going to say, I'm doing it with confidence. I'm doing it with peace of mind, and I can make it with assurance. And that's worth a lot of money.
Absolutely. No, that's fantastic. The one that I really want, the interesting thing about it was that it was up for auction like 3 weeks ago. And so, I got to see, it initially was listed for 500,000, and then it kept saying reserve not met, moved up to 600, 700, 800. And it's a $2 million building at least. But it has no anchor tenants. It's, got all these vacancies. And so I was running all the numbers and realizing the value that I would add if I leased the spaces to myself. I was thinking about, could we try and buy this? And realized that, like, oh, if you plug in the rent from the dental offices here, or the dental office that I would lease to myself, that increases the property value by $1 million, because they're going from no anchor tenants without this rent locked in. All of a sudden that goes around, you could flip that and sell it. So it made me realize, like, oh, that's what we're bringing to the table, is $1 million, sometimes of value to this landlord, especially if they're have a bunch of vacancies that they didn't have before.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So going to this decision, this will be our last little conversation before we wrap things up here today. Purchasing versus leasing. I want to hear your thoughts. I have some biased opinions, but I'm okay either way. What do you think about this decision for a dentist?
Well, purchasing versus leasing is very similar to saying, should I be in a retail building or an office building? You're going to hear people on both sides of it. You're going to hear both doctors, administrators, consultants, and we hear it across the board. People say, you have to own. I will not let you lease. And they have this whole pitch on why ownership makes more sense. And then the flip side, you'll hear people that are adamant saying, I will not let any of my clients own, or whatever it is, whatever their argument. It's the same exact thing I said earlier. You should go look at all your options. You should look at all your options to lease and then all your options to purchase. The reality is this, that some markets are not going to have any good options to purchase. Commercial real estate, if you take it coast to coast, small city, big city, well over 90% of all transactions that happen in commercial real estate are leases versus purchases. And so by default, depending on the market, there's usually not that many legitimate options to purchase that are available. Buying land, building your own building, that's an option in some markets. There's certain other areas you couldn't buy a piece of ground if you want to. Like the city that I'm in right now, Lone Tree, Colorado, there's not one piece of ground you could buy and build your own building if you wanted to. It's not available. If you want to go further east or south, that's an option. But if you want to be right here in this city that I'm in, there's not one option for you to buy a piece of land that would meet your requirement, or at least one that would make sense. There's a piece of ground that's $5 million, but you can't make sense of that.
Sure.
It needs to have a 10-story building put on it. So here's the deal. You look at options to lease, you look at options to purchase, and then the best thing you can do is run a detailed purchase versus lease comparison. Just we talked about earlier, you can't just take a face rate of a retail property versus a medical property, because you got to factor in utilities, you got to factor in janitorial, you got to factor in HVAC maintenance, stuff like that. When it comes to purchasing, you can afford to pay more for a purchase than a lease, because you're going to pick up additional tax deductions with depreciation and other things that are not available when you lease. You're going to get additional deductions as the owner of that building that you don't get when you lease. You still get to write off the entire lease payment, because if you buy a building as a doctor, you're going to buy the building in an LLC. You're going to lease the property from the LLC to the practice. So the practice is going to get the same write-off no matter what. The practice is still going to pay rent either to a third-party landlord or to the doctor that owns it themselves. So the practice gets the same write-offs usually either way. But the doctor picks up then the depreciation, the mortgage interest deduction as well on the loan. And so the doctor picks up a bunch of additional tax deductions that weren't there if you leased. And then ultimately, the reason people purchase, There's a lot of reasons, but the main reason is because you want that principal pay down. You want every month that you cut that check for $10,000, you want $4,000 per month, as an example, paying down the principal balance of the loan, because every time that happens, your net worth goes up by that amount of money proportionally. If you cut a $10,000 check and you did a 25-year loan or 20-year loan, approximately $4,000 goes to pay down the loan balance. Your net worth's going up by $4,000 a month. And so
Right.
all of a sudden, almost $50,000 a year, your balance sheet just increased, your net worth just increased. That's a tremendous reason to own. And so you might have a scenario where ownership might cost you a couple $1,000s per month more to own than lease. But again, you're going to get more tax deductions. So you might pay more to a mortgage company than you would to a landlord, but then you're going to pay less to the federal government on the ownership side than if you lease. And so it can start to balance out very quickly. And then you factor in that final principal pay down, and $4,000 or $5,000 going into a forced savings account per month. That's pretty compelling. The flip side, or in addition, I guess I'd say, you also have appreciation. You have the fact that, traditionally real estate values go up over time, just like the stock market. I mean, they kind of go up and down, but over time they keep going. And you might have a property that you buy for $1.4 million, and in 25 years it might be worth $1.8 million or $2 million. And so that's there. But all that to be said, look at options of lease, look at options of purchase. If you have a chance to purchase, though, I'm a huge fan of ownership. I'm a huge fan of buying real estate for a lot of reasons. One, it's an asset that is in addition to your practice that a lot of times is worth more than the practice itself. And we do a ton of deals where there's transitions happening or sales happening. 3/4 the time the real estate's involved is worth more than the practice. All right. So that's compelling. Not having to deal with landlord negotiations, that's compelling. But again, I could put together a whole argument for why leasing makes sense too. Huge TI allowance, free rent, not paying during build out, flexibility to move locations, landlord pays for all the issues, all the maintenance, a lot less headaches, a lot less hassle. So it's, again, no one size fits all. Look at all your options, make an informed decision, and you find yourself on either side of that equation.
No, and I love that, man, and that definitely brought a lot of nuance that my argument doesn't have. My thing is, you ultimately got to go for the space that is going to help you have the most successful practice. And if, especially in acquisitions, if you have to buy the building to get the right practice, then you buy the building. If if the practice is worth it and it's going to be a good situation. If you have to lease to buy that practice because there is no option to buy, then you lease. When you're doing a startup, you have a little bit more control and more options because you can choose from a wide variety of real estate situations. And that's where running that comparison matters more. I'm a fan of doing whatever makes the most sense for your practice to be the best engine, and then go invest in commercial real estate elsewhere. So then your eggs aren't all in that one basket.
Well,
so there's a lot of different ways to do it.
That is a point that's very, very important to note. A lot of times people say, well, I have to own, and then they'll choose an inferior location. And we're like, okay, great. You're going to pay down $3,000 a month in principal, but your practice is going to do $40,000 per month less in this location because it's a terrible property, or you're not going to get the internal referrals, or it's harder to find, or whatever it is. And so, yeah, you've got to look at it as what's going to be the strongest driver for the practice first, and then the real estate comes second. So I agree with you 100%. If you have an apples to apples where both locations are even or neutral, and it makes more sense to purchase, great. But yeah, if you get a scenario where the option to purchase is worse location, worse building, going to limit your internal referrals, staff's not going to be as excited to show up there, that's going to parlay into how they communicate with patients, et cetera. Yeah, choose the practice all day long over the real estate.
Well, this has been awesome. So if someone is either at the point where they're ready to renegotiate a lease in an existing space, maybe they're buying a practice that has a lease in place and they need that evaluated as part of the transition, or they're looking to do a startup, what's the best way to figure out who's the Carr person in my area? How do I work with Carr Realty?
Yeah, the best way to get a hold of us is our website. It's carr.us, carr.us. Upper right-hand corner of our website, we have a handful of options. One, you can just click to find an agent. You can go to your state and your city, and then you get in touch with the agent or the agents that specialize in your specific vertical in that city. If it's medical, if it's veterinary, if it's dental, we have agents that specialize just in those verticals in cities. So that's one way to do it. We also have an offer for a free lease evaluation. If you're in a property and you want to know how does my current terms compare to the market, whether you have 1 year left or you just signed a lease and you've got 9 years left, we'll do a detailed lease evaluation and let you know if you have a good, average, or bad deal and what you should expect in your next transaction, when to start your next transaction, et cetera. And then we also have a ton of resources. We have a resource tab that has dozens of articles, dozens of videos, and they're educational based. So if you want to learn more about, landlord tactics or common mistakes that you want to avoid during your next transaction, purchasing versus leasing, you can get a lot of information there. We have a huge library, and we work really hard to make sure that doctors are educated.
Well, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I appreciate what you've built and Bobby Lind here in Indianapolis and who I've been working with. It's been a great experience, and thank you for coming on the show.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Cool. Well, we will talk with you guys next time on the Shared Practices podcast.